3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic will be an overview of fraud protection. My name is Peggy, and I'll be your moderator today. We're broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the TechTalks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. We have an SME on the line today who will be responding to your questions during today's presentation, and there will be time at the end for any further questions. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now on to the presentation. Aman, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Peggy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Tech Talk on a new Dynamics product called Fraud Protection. For today's talk, I'll give an overview of the industry landscape, where the product fits, a demo, a talk about the integration with Dynamics Commerce, and few implementation tips. I'm joined in this talk by Josue from the Fraud Protection Engineering team to help me with any Q&A. So let's get started. Today's talk has 4 objectives: overview of the product, a demo, integration with commerce, and few implementation pointers. Fraud of all kinds happens at all stages of a customer's purchase journey, whether online or in-store. Right from when you create an account, when you use your account to go online, to when you purchase, and when you return the goods. Some of the common fraud cases you may be familiar with are the loyalty fraud, phishing attacks, stolen passwords, price scraping, and discounts fraud. But there are many more, and the list keeps growing as fraudsters keep evolving. Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection is designed to cover fraud end-to-end. It has 3 capabilities broadly, which customers can implement separately or altogether. You have purchase protection, you have account protection, and you have loss prevention. For this talk, I will mainly focus on the purchase protection capability. E-commerce is booming. That is not news to anyone. By this year 2020, we are expecting to see almost $4 trillion worth of e-commerce trade occurring worldwide. And now, after the COVID-19 pandemic, people are staying at home more, ordering at home more, so these estimates will go even higher. The problem with e-commerce booming is that fraud is also booming. $250 billion worth of fraud per year. This is total economic impact over the course of a year, $250 billion. The more interesting bit here is that $90 billion of that $250 billion is direct fraud loss, like goods that were handed off to fraudsters and which were then resold. The rest of the $175 billion is this related costs that happen along with fraud. That is the total cost of a merchant's manual reviews, their fraud operations teams, and so on and so forth. It is an expensive problem and a problem that is not being solved efficiently. Now let's take a look at few industry examples of fraud to help us understand the problem a little bit better. A retail fraud using stolen credit cards. One example seen in US is where fraudsters use foreclosed homes to receive goods. Fraudsters go online, buy some goods, and have everything shipped to a foreclosed home. Delivery is made, and fraudsters collect it all. There is no way you're ever going to be able to recover those goods. How do you stop this kind of fraud? Another example that we see is in the travel space. With the shift to online travel bookings, there's this entirely new kind of fraud. Fraudsters are attacking reward points, loyalty, and short stay rental services. In case of short stay, one example of fraud seen is when there are fake properties listed. On the web, it looks like a 5-star property, but reality is completely opposite. Many times what we see is that it's organized crime that is creating these fake listings, and these listings show up on the short stay websites. Now, the worst part is that on top of your money, they also get to collect some of your payment information. Not only you are paying them for something fraudulent, they are also getting information about you that they can then use to perpetuate further attacks. The problem keeps worsening. The other example that we have is in the entertainment space. The simplest example here would be, say, a new rock concert goes on sale, and you see 30 seconds later, all the tickets are sold out. And then 2 hours later, most of those tickets show up again on a secondary market at another website at 4 times the price. This is fraudsters using bot networks to go and purchase as many tickets possible, which then they can turn around and resell at a hefty markup. In the entertainment space in particular, there is an extreme need to catch this kind of fraud quick, because once that date of that concert passes, those goods have no value. Customers can't wait days for a chargeback. For those who may not know, a chargeback is when a buyer disputes a transaction on the credit card and the bank agrees and charges it instead on the merchant. It's a loss to the merchant, and all merchants want to keep chargebacks to a minimum. Merchants and organizers need to be extremely aggressive at stopping these kind of fraud upfront, but also not so aggressive that customers can't even buy the product. There are 3 main players in each commerce or e-commerce transaction. The first being the customer, who's front and center for both the merchant and the bank, which are the other 2 players. The fraud impacts all of these 3 parties. For the customer, the common challenges in transactions are associated with authentication and card acceptance. Nobody wants to go through 5 steps of authentication. If it is not smooth, high chances customers will simply give up, never to return to the site. Loyalty is lost forever. For the merchant, the challenges are about controlling the cost of goods sold by controlling fraud losses, cost of manual reviews, loss of business from abandoned cards, loss of reputation among their customer base, and wrongful rejects, all of which increase the operational costs and impact a merchant's revenue. For the bank, it's a simple equation of lower profits because of wrongful rejects. So all three main players in a transaction get impacted by fraud and rejects made wrongfully. Now, in the market today, the fraud systems handle fraud mostly manually. And they do this by setting a bunch of rules manually. A list that needs to be kept up to date. Your fraud operations teams will assess the recent fraud activities in the business and create rules to address similar fraud attacks. It's very inefficient. For example, your fraud operations team says that they're seeing a lot of transactions where the fraudsters are trying to buy, say, 10 jackets. So I'm going to say that for any transaction for 10 jackets in this geo and say with this velocity, I'm going to kick off a manual review. The problem is that the fraudsters will figure it out. And then instead of buying 10 jackets, they will buy 9 jackets. So it's this constant game of cat and mouse between your fraud operations team and the fraudsters. But it's a game that you're not really set up to win because fraudsters are getting more sophisticated in their ability to execute complex fraud at scale. Now, on top of being inefficient, manual reviews are just plain expensive and a terrible customer experience. You may have personally experienced where you make a purchase and the customer service portal shows your order is accepted and that will be shipping in 2 days, but you figure out a full day later with an email that your transaction has been removed. If you know enough about the fraud space, you will know that what happened was your transaction got queued up for a manual review. Somebody took a look at it 24 hours later and then decided to decline that transaction. That's a terrible experience. You were expecting to receive your purchase in 2 days, but instead you find out later your transaction was declined. All told, these rule-based systems worked circa 2004, but they don't really work these days with the level of complexity and sophistication the fraudsters can deploy. Now the question is, how does Dynamics 365 fraud protection solve these challenges? Dynamics 365 fraud protection is Microsoft's solution to combating online payment and account fraud. It is based on technology that Microsoft built in-house. About 6 years ago, Microsoft was getting hit by online retail fraud, and Microsoft has 20% of the world's AI patents. So the team in Microsoft decided to fix the problem themselves. 2 years ago, we brought together our best AI, e-commerce, and fraud protection experts to build a smart solution to fight fraud. Soon after, we realized that our numbers were looking amazing and that we should commercialize this technology that we had built. And so fraud protection is the result. When Microsoft set about building the product, we focused on 3 things. The first one is to increase revenue. And we wanted to do this by decreasing wrongful rejections or false positives. Second component we wanted to focus on in the product was to reduce operational expenses. Obviously, being an anti-fraud product, it is built to stop fraud first and foremost. So that is one of the core metrics. But the other core metrics we focused on was to reduce the cost and incidences of manual reviews. We wanted to optimize that space to further reduce the overall overhead of a merchant. Ultimately, all of this is in service of a smoother shopping experience for the customers. At the end of the day, if the customer can buy the goods that they want, the customer is happy. The merchant is happy and the bank is happy. Everybody wins except the fraudsters, and we are okay with that. How does this thing work? Fraud protection is focused on 4 core pillars of technology, and I will talk about these now. Adaptive AI. This is the USP of this product, unique selling proposition, the core offering. How is this AI special? Well, Microsoft has over 10 AI patents just in fraud protection space alone. It uses transactional data from a number of customers, all de-identified, hashed, and salted, and comes up with its recommendations and scores that help the customer team then take action. I will talk more about the machine learning innovation in next few slides. Second technology pillar here is the fraud protection network. All this AI technology runs on top of this fraud protection network, and this is one of the more innovative components of the product. We have built a consortium approach, and it brings up this concept of what we call herd immunity. You may have heard of this term in the news recently. It shows up in epidemiology and it shows up in fraud as well. Let's say a fraudster attacks customer A, and customer A happens to be within a fraud protection network. The AI will determine that an attack is happening and essentially immunize itself against that attack. Now we understand those patterns and devices, the payment instruments, the shipping addresses, all of those entities that are associated with those fraudulent activities. Fraudsters tend to move literally through an environment. They'll go attack one large retailer, then they'll go and attack another, say, baby food company, and they'll just keep going until the bank shuts them down because they want to extract every last ounce of value that they can out of the cards that they stole. The concept of herd immunity in this context means that if they attack customer A and we immunize against that attack, and then they move over to attack another customer B who happens to be within our network, then customer B is already protected because we have already identified those patterns with those attacks and we have immunized. Thus, it becomes this stronger together story, and Microsoft is customer zero in this network. Any merchant or any company that comes online on fraud protection gets the power of not just rest of the customers within this network, but also Microsoft's entire global e-commerce footprint, which is billions of transactions a year in 192 plus countries. Next innovative component here is the transaction acceptance booster service. I mentioned earlier that we built this fraud protection ourselves first. Microsoft built this technology, and then we went to a number of banks to share part of those calculations, those risk assessment scores that we calculate. And we shared those with those banks as an input to those banks' own risk engines. So what we saw was over time, there was an incredible lift in bank acceptance rates, which again translated to pure revenue growth for all of Microsoft's businesses. And now we offer the same capability as part of this fraud protection solution to our customers who can choose to opt in for this feature. And we have several multinational banks already signed up to this special program. So this is another innovation. Another feature of the product itself is the customer escalation support tool. This view is meant for your customer support agents and gives them all the information needed to evaluate customer escalations, make decisions, take actions to say block or unblock transactions quickly and effectively. The unique feature in this tool is this box, risk information. We have a patent on this technology that allows us to go back into the machine learning model, identify the key nodes that were critical to making that decision, extract them, score them, rank them, and then spit them out in a human readable form. This text here. And I will show this in a demo as well. This information is quite handy for the frontline customer support agents when they're speaking to a customer to explain why a particular transaction was rejected. It's really handy. Now, let's talk a little bit about the architecture behind the product. On the left-hand side, you can see that you have your merchant and your merchant's customer. A customer comes and buys stuff online. And that transaction goes down the same auth and settle flow. It goes to the gateway, the payment facilitator. From there, it goes to the acquirer, the processor, then to the card network, Visa, Amex, MasterCard, and then it goes to the bank. The bank makes its decision and then passes it back. It is at this point in time that most fraud protection products go to work. They operate in what's known as a post-oath model, where they basically let the bank take the first crack at making a decision about a transaction, and then the product cleans up whatever is left. Fraud protection operates a little bit differently. We operate in what's known as a pre-oath model. And how that works is when a customer puts items in the cart and hits buy, the first call goes out to fraud protection. Customer passes us a bunch of contextual information, and the solution passes back a risk assessment score. This approach has several benefits built in. One of the key benefits is that you as a merchant can decide upfront if you want to accept or reject a transaction. You have complete control, which saves you the cost of having to go through the gateways, the acquirers, and the bank, who will all extract their cut. By the time transaction reaches the bank and the bank sends it back, you have already incurred significant cost for a transaction that you might end up declining anyways. So it is much better to pre-filter those kind of transactions. One of the other benefits of calling this in this pre-auth model is that you improve the overall population of transactions that you send to the bank. If you're sending the bank a lot of risky transactions where there's a high chance of fraud, the bank's risk engines will attune to that and they will become more conservative, and then they will clamp down. As a result, you as a merchant will suffer as your overall approval rates will go down. Now, if you're pre-filtering a lot of those junk transactions before you send them over to the bank's risk engines will relax a little bit because they're seeing a lower incidence rate of fraud. That in and of itself can relate to modest rise in your acceptance rates. And then along with our transaction acceptance booster service that I talked about in one of the previous slides, we make this even more powerful. In the case when merchant has opted to directly share fraud protections assessment with those participating banks and networks through this transaction acceptance booster service, we will also send what we call trust knowledge over to those partner banks. What that trust knowledge does is it gives those issuing banks some additional information, context, that is associated with the transaction, which could then help them make a better decision. Now, there's a small box up there called Forensics and Learning. One of the things that we collect in addition to the transaction payload that a merchant sends us is device information. So we have also built this in the product, a device fingerprinting solution. It provides additional capabilities around the actual device that is making the call. We profile over 150 unique features from those devices, and all of that information flows into the network. And that allows us to start getting those multiplier effects across purchases, across accounts, and across customers. We have a lot of context because of this device fingerprinting solution. Now, you don't need to deploy device fingerprinting solution in order to get value, as there are other capabilities in the product helping you fight fraud. But the benefit of this device fingerprinting is you will get additional benefits because we will know those devices as well. So more context, and that will result into maximum impact of the product, which we strongly suggest to our customers on board to use. Now, a little bit about the fraud protection network itself. Two core concepts to land here. One of them is what we often get asked from our customers. In this fraud protection network, can other people see my data? No. Does it mean that anybody else could get access to my sensitive data? No. Does my data live outside of my environment? No. Your data lives within your tenant and it is controlled by you. No other merchants can see that information. The only time data ever crosses the trust boundary to leave your environment is when we pull it into the fraud protection network. And we don't do so until it has been de-identified, hashed, and salted in a way that makes it unreasonable to reverse engineer. That information is then passed into the fraud protection network. In other words, no data flows into the network that in any way can be linked back to you as a merchant or to your customers. No one can look inside the fraud protection network, because if you were to look inside, all you would see are a bunch of blobs of text that make no sense. We don't care that it's Mary, we don't care that it's John. What we care about is that this blob of text matches with this other blob of text that has, say, 25 chargebacks associated. The system is designed to look for patterns. It's not interested in developing the list of known good or known bad. It's all about the patterns and the linkages. The second point to land here is that because of this architecture, where we use de-identified data and not share any data and only provide a score back, we are inherently compatible and compliant with GDPR, CCPA, and other compliances. Machine learning. A lot of innovation in this space. I will talk about two. Semi-supervised learning. As you may know, machine learning algorithms are of two types, supervised and unsupervised. With supervised learning, the idea is we're going to teach the computer how to do something using labeled training data, whereas in unsupervised learning, we are going to let it learn by itself, identify the patterns emerging by itself. Now, typically, a pure anomaly detection algorithm is an example of an unsupervised algorithm. But here in fraud protection, we have a semi-supervised machine learning algorithm as we leverage inherent knowledge a merchant's fraud team may have to optimize the system for their business. Ultimately, a merchant knows their business better than anybody. So we wanted to utilize their knowledge to tune the system and protect them. This is the adaptive AI that I talked about in one of the previous slides, the core offering. Machine learning algorithms work best when combined with human knowledge, and that is how AI should be implemented in real-world settings, outside lab environments, like what we have done with fraud protection. Machine learning is a very exciting and innovative space, and something I'm personally passionate about. Second example of innovation here is this fraud virtual analyst. This is essentially your AI co-pilot. It is designed to help your fraud team configure and find those optimal operating points to maximize the KPIs that are important to your business. The virtual analyst will also suggest rules, operating points, and recommend ways you can improve KPIs configured in your environment. One of the other strengths that we have within the fraud protection network is this concept of verticals. It adds a bit of nuance to the inner workings of our machine learning models. I'll give you an example. We understand that fraud attack vectors in the retail space may look completely different from fraud attack vectors in the gaming space. If you're selling physical goods that are shipped from a warehouse, your attack vectors and your potential loss rates are different from digital goods or digital assets that you are selling, say, in an Xbox store, which can be revoked or called back. Because of this, we have built the concept of verticals within a fraud protection network that allows us to further optimize and further fine-tune the machine learning models based on fraud that looks alike or transactions that look alike. As a result, whenever we score a particular transaction, we will score it not just against the broader network, but we will also score it against that vertical. Our models essentially score a transaction hundreds of different ways, and then all of those individual scores come back and get merged into one master score that we would then pass back. By the time a score comes back to you as a merchant, as an output of the solution, we have scored it and checked it against a whole plethora of combinations and optimizations to try and find the best possible collection of risk assessment and compress all of that into one score. There are three different experiences in the product. The first one is a diagnosis experience where we will take your historical transaction data information from your environment. We will run it through our machine learning, and that will spit out two reports: a data diagnostic report, which helps identify and understand the quality of your data, and a risk diagnostic report, which helps understand what we could do with your data. We also offer an evaluate experience where you can go through the API integration process, get onboarded, and start calling us in a shadow mode. In this case, your payment system continues to work as normal. Your fraud protection system, which is not Dynamics, works as normal, but in the background, you're calling us also in shadow. In 45 to 60 days after you have been calling us in shadow mode, we will present you with a report showing the KPIs and the lift that you would have experienced had you been using Dynamics Fraud Protection instead of whatever you have been using. And then finally, if and when you decide that you would like to actively use our product in your production environment, we move you into the protect mode where you purchase the product and it becomes your primary fraud protection capability. Let's see a demo. Diagnose experience. This is the no code solution for customers to see what kind of fraud is happening. So there's a GIF running. I will talk over the GIF. As I said in the previous slide, in essence, you upload historical data and so the system produces two reports, data report and risk report. Data report helps businesses understand the quality of the data, which basically helps you understand the scores, because the scores are only as good as the data inputted. We identify empty values, we identify additional fields that can be useful as part of these assessments in order to produce better data. We also notice any formatting errors, we notice any missing data that can be replaced. All of these findings we will catch and report. You can also download this report and then you can discuss those findings within your teams. It helps you kick off a conversation among your executive teams to get a sense of what this data is that you can then use to produce better scores for your business. Once you're happy with the data report, you can go see the next report, which is the risk diagnostic report. This is when we get into the nitty-gritty of how fraud looks like in your org. You can slice and dice data using slider bars, which will give you a better sense of fraud. Whether you have more fraudulent transactions or good transactions, what is actually flowing through the system. You have the models which you can then tune through slider bars to help you understand those operating points and what they mean for your business. Ultimately, you can block all fraud by blocking all transactions, and that'll kill your business. The trick is in finding that sweet spot, and this system will help you find that sweet spot. But it lets you get a sense and play with the parameters yourself first. So if I block this much fraud, this is the money I'm leaving on the table. System also identifies top risk factors, risky actors, risky IP addresses, what it is really that is impacting the business. For each customer, this list can be different. So you really would want to know what risk impacts your business the most. Finally, you get to download this report, which again will help you get a sense of what fraud looks like in your business. Once you go through the diagnose experience, you're more educated of how fraud looks like. Then you can move to the evaluate experience. You would need to integrate the APIs into your e-commerce and possibly enable device fingerprinting. And you can go and use the virtual fraud analyst. Virtual fraud analyst. This is designed to suggest operating points. System will go through your data and learn from it and allow you to create rules. For example, say high chargeback countries or say users in a particular country. The system will identify those list of countries that lead to high chargebacks, which can be a problem for your business, and identify and suggest operating points that you can use to maximize the amount of good traffic flowing through your system while reducing total amount of fraud, which helps you maximize and tune your revenue and profits. Now, like other Dynamics products, we have a very impressive dashboard, which runs on Power BI. You can export all of this data, and if a customer has the reporting mechanisms which they want to include this data in, they can do that. This scorecard is basically a pulse check for your business, for executives to see how their online business is performing. You can check your volumes, your bank acceptance rates, your chargeback rates, all those important metrics, and how fraud can be handled. Finally, we move to the Protect experience. One of the key features of Protect is support. There will be customers who get a decline or issues with their transactions, and they will call you and ask why they were declined. So the support tool is built for those first line customer support agents to field those calls and get a sense of what the system was thinking when it made a particular recommendation. So an agent gets a call from a customer, agent enters the customer's email and get their transactions history and other metrics. If you select a particular transaction, you can see what the risk score was. A customer talks to the agent and explains, say, for example, that they chose a particular location different from their usual location because they were buying for a friend. Then the agent can make an informed decision to either allow the transaction as safe or keep it blocked if they perceive it to be a clear case of fraud. And the system will learn from these decisions and train its models to be better next time. Power of machine learning. Another feature the system provides is a graph explorer. This is designed for both customer agents and fraud analysts. Imagine a transaction comes for review and nobody is entirely sure whether it's legitimate or not. You can go into the Graph Explorer and find that user and that user's purchases. You can select a purchase and see all its details, say payment instrument. And then you can see that the same payment instrument is also linked to 25 other customers. What are the odds one credit card is linked to 25 customers? Not much. So you can identify fraud by visualizing using this tool. Then there are rules. You as a merchant can define a set of rules to assess the legitimacy of transactions and use those scores to automate those workflows. At what score you want to reject the transactions automatically. You can also define a list and add that to those rules, which gives you more control over those rules. It's very configurable. On top of all those lists, and within those lists, you can add more granularity. You can add high risk products, high risk countries, all of which you want to avoid approving transactions for. Now let's talk a bit about integration with D365 for Commerce. We support out-of-box integration between Dynamics 365 Commerce and Fraud Protection. No customization needed, only configuration. Next few slides, I'll talk about how that architecture looks, the data flows between these two solutions, and how the setup looks. All the communication between fraud protection and commerce uses secure tokens. A token setup is done in fraud protection and commerce backend is updated with that information. There are few events here. The primary purchase event assessment, which is used to reduce fraud and false positives, and the ancillary events, purchase status and bank decision events, which help train the AI. A typical flow for a purchase event can be something like this. An online customer adds items to the basket and proceeds to checkout. She then enters shipping and payment details. After all the prerequisites are completed, she then places the order. Order details are sent to fraud protection for purchase protection assessment. If the merchant rules defined in fraud protection decide that the order should be rejected because, say, for example, the billing address does not match the shipping address, a response is sent back to the storefront and the order is terminated. And the user receives an error message saying that the order cannot be processed. The benefits of this integration are that you can assess fraud risk for purchase transactions real time. Run pre-authorization during the checkout flow itself. A similar flow can happen to assess fraud risk for account creation transactions. This is the error message. And if the customer later calls the call center and inquires why the transaction was not successful, the agent can look up the history as we saw before, all the past transactional details, device fingerprints, the risk scores, the reason codes, and fully explain the rationale to the customer. And if the customer seems to be genuine, agent can then override that decision and allow the transaction to go through. This is how you enable the integration. In retail parameters in Dynamics Commerce Backoffice, you need to enable this flag and give information to set up security and authentication between the two services. The assessment type can be evaluate or protect, as we saw before, the different experiences. By default, the assessment type is set to evaluate, in which case the fraud protection solution will passively check orders for fraud, but won't actively reject orders. So merchants can compare fraud protection risk assessments with their current fraud tools to understand the impact of fraud protection on acceptance rates. Or if the assessment type field is set to protect, then fraud protection will return reject assessments and fraudulent orders will be terminated before they are sent for authorization. And you need the Dynamics fraud protection endpoint URL, which will be provided once you sign up for fraud protection. The integration setup requires that a secret be used when commerce communicates with fraud protection to get a purchase protection result. That secret must be stored using an Azure Key Vault client. The benefit is that the fraud protection certificate stored in Key Vault can be referenced only if it is referenced by Key Vault parameters in the Commerce backoffice. So it's very secure. Now, few notes on implementation. As part of implementation, customers are to give their e-commerce data points for data mapping. We need to go through the APIs, their purpose, the data schema behind each API, and identify and map customers' data schema. Data mapping helps link two data models and is needed for data to flow between customers' e-commerce and fraud protection. We need merchants onboarded to follow the same specification definition to make sure model performance is kept optimum for everyone. Specification like purchase amount format, country code format, etc. We have a data schema of over 100 data attributes to let the machine learning model make the risk assessment. A good data set should have a balanced representation of these four quadrants: who, what, where, and when. Take customers' data attributes, do the calculation, and come up with a score. A minimum score of 100 is needed to get a decent score. Higher the points, better the performance. We have assigned 3 different weightages of 5, 3, and 1 based on the data attribute type. There can be a number of attributes we can collect, but Please note that not everything needs to be collected. I will give you an example. This is an example of mapping a customer's payment methods. In this case, as part of the integration work, we need to map those payment methods to the type attribute fraud protection supports. An exercise. So the point of this exercise is to show that more data attributes don't necessarily mean more points or better performance. Idea is to get high quality attributes that lead to better model performance and better scores. A note on the APIs. For now, we have APIs for purchase protection capability and for account protection capability, and these are real time. Within purchase and account, there are again two kinds of APIs. One is the primary assessment event API, which does the actual job at the time of checkout flow. This API is called real time to assess the risk and help accept or reject the transaction. The other APIs are ancillary and they help train the machine learning models. For example, in purchase transaction assessment, information like purchase status, bank decision, final status, etc. provide more context around the transaction and make the models better. For example, purchase status event sends an update of the status, whether successful or cancelled. Bank event status tells whether the bank approved or rejected the bank authorization. All the API's documentation is on docs. That was the last slide. Hopefully you now have a better idea of the new Dynamics fraud protection solution, the problems it is meant to solve, the advanced AI technology that it is built on, how it integrates natively with Dynamics 365 Commerce, and few considerations for implementation. I will now hand over to Josue for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aman. I don't see any additional questions coming through on the Q&A window, so I think we're going to go ahead and hand this back to Peggy. But if you have any questions or think of anything in the meantime, our contact information is available here. Please do not hesitate to reach out. So with that, I'll hand it back to Peggy.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Great presentation, Aman. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session and what you'd like to see in future events. The survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording and deck will be available on the TechTalks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. So with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and our audience. Have a great day or evening, wherever you are.